The hiss of the aerosol nozzle was the only confession Leo Vance ever made. It was 3 a.m. in the Blackwood district, a rusted-out artery of the city where the streetlights had long since surrendered to the encroaching gloom. Suspended 40 feet in the air on a precarious, rust-flaked scaffolding, Leo moved like a phantom conducting a symphony of synthetic color. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, decaying garbage, and the sharp, chemical bite of acrylic paint. With a gloved finger, he pressed down on the cap of a can of radioactive fuchsia. A vibrant, screaming arc of pink lashed across the soot-stained bricks of the abandoned textile mill. To the untrained, which, in Leo's experience, was virtually everyone's, the mural taking shape was a chaotic, garish assault on the senses. It was a monstrous, 20-foot koi fish, rendered in toxic neon greens, blinding magentas, and electric cyans, seemingly swimming through a turbulent ocean of burning skyscrapers. It was loud. It was obnoxious. It was entirely deliberate. Too much color, Vance, the local art blogs would sneer. A grotesque miscalculation of the urban aesthetic. The man paints like a child who swallowed a prism and violently expelled it onto the concrete. Leo smiled, the expression hidden beneath the respirator strapped to his face. He loved his critics. Their mockery was the perfect armor. They were so busy scoffing at the blinding surface that they never thought to look beneath it. He swapped the fuchsia for a specialized, unlabeled can he kept in the deep pocket of his cargo jacket. This paint didn't smell like the others. It was odorless, a proprietary blend of clear acrylic and rare earth phosphors that Leo had synthesized in his cramped basement apartment. In normal light, it dried entirely transparent, a glossy ghost against the brick. But under the right wavelength of ultraviolet light, it burned like a trapped star. Leo leaned close to the wall, his breath fogging the plastic of his mask. He began to paint over the dense, clashing scales of the neon koi fish. He didn't use broad, sweeping strokes this time. He moved with microscopic precision, tracing hard, jagged lines that contrasted violently with the fluid curves of the fish. 40.7128° N. He paused, shaking the can to keep the phosphors suspended. The ball bearing rattled, a hollow, metallic heartbeat in the dead of the night. 74.0060° W. He added a series of secondary numbers, manifesting a precise building block, an exact loading dock on the eastern waterfront. It was the address of a derelict canning factory that officially belonged to a defunct shell corporation. Unofficially, it belonged to Marcus Thorne. Leo had spent 3 nights huddled on the freezing rooftops above the shipping yards, watching the unmarked trucks roll in at midnight. He had watched men with assault rifles slung over tailored suits offload crates that were far too heavy to contain auto parts. He had seen the distinct, chilling silhouette of Marcus, the Viper, Thorne himself, standing under the sodium lamps, orchestrating the lifeblood of the city's illegal arms and narcotics trade. Leo couldn't go to the police. A street artist with a rap sheet for vandalism and a reputation as a hack wasn't exactly a credible witness. Besides, Thorne had half the precinct on his payroll. But Leo had a voice. It was written in 10-foot letters across the skin of the city. He just needed the right person to hear it. By 6 a.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective. Dawn broke over Blackwood, washing the grim streets in a pale, bruised light. Leo stood on the opposite sidewalk, a steaming cup of bodega coffee warming his paint-stained hands, watching the city wake up to his latest atrocity. It didn't take long for the crowd to gather. Commuters in drab gray coats stopped to stare, their faces twisting in varying degrees of confusion and distaste. "It's an eyesore," muttered a man in a bespoke suit, clutching a leather briefcase. "Who keeps letting this cipher guy deface the neighborhood? It's supposed to be post-ironic, I think," a college student offered weakly, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. "A commentary on the hypercommercialization of nature. Though, I must admit, the color palette is aggressively primitive." Leo took a slow sip of his black coffee, relishing the bitter burn. Primitive. Post-ironic. Eyesore, asterisk it was perfect. The low, predatory purr of a V12 engine cut through the morning chatter. The crowd parted instinctively as a matte black Maybach glided down the narrow, potholed street, its tinted windows dark and impenetrable. The car slowed, coming to a halt directly beneath the sprawling neon mural. The rear window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Marcus Thorne didn't look like a man who ran the most ruthless smuggling syndicate on the eastern seaboard. He had the sharp, aristocratic features of a Wall Street titan, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes the color of a winter ocean. He wore a charcoal cashmere coat that probably cost more than Leo's entire life. Thorne stared up at the giant, blindingly pink koi fish. His expression was flat, devoid of amusement or anger. It was the look of a man evaluating a piece of trash on the sidewalk. Leo held his breath, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Look closer, he thought, almost vibrating with the tension. Look right at it, you arrogant bastard. Thorne's cold eyes swept over the violently colored scales, passing directly over the invisible coordinates that spelled out his doom. A faint sneer curled the corner of Thorne's mouth. He tapped the glass. The window rolled up, and the Maybach slid away into the morning traffic, leaving behind a faint smell of expensive exhaust. Leo let out a long, ragged exhale. The Viper had looked right at the knife poised at his throat and seen only a joke. 12 hours later, the bruised dawn had given way to a starless, suffocating night. The Blackwood district was practically empty, save for the feral cats and the ghosts of the industrial age. Detective Sarah Jenkins stood in the alleyway, the collar of her trench coat turned up against the biting wind. She looked like a woman who had forgotten how to sleep. Deep, purple shadows bruised the skin beneath her sharp hazel eyes, and her knuckles were white as she gripped a heavily redacted case file. 10 years on the force had chipped away her idealism, leaving behind a hardened, cynical core that ran entirely on nicotine, caffeine, and an obsessive need to bring Marcus Thorne to justice. For 2 years, she had chased ghosts. Every time she got close to Thorne's smuggling operation, the evidence vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Warehouses burned to the ground. Thorne was a phantom who left no fingerprints. Jenkins kicked a crushed beer can into a puddle, cursing softly under her breath. Another dead end. A confidential informant had promised her a location for Thorne's next incoming shipment, only to turn up floating in the harbor with his tongue cut out. She leaned back against the hood of her unmarked sedan, rubbing her temples to stave off a brewing migraine. That was when she looked up and saw it. Jesus Christ, she muttered, recoiling slightly. The mural dominated the entire side of the brick building. Even in the dim ambient light of a distant street lamp, the neon colors seemed to scream at her. A giant, deformed fish swimming through fire. Vance, she sighed, recognizing the chaotic signature style of the city's most ridiculed street artist. She had arrested Leo Cypher Vance twice for trespassing. He was a quiet, unassuming kid who played the eccentric idiot a little too well. She had always thought his art was atrocious, an overcompensation for a lack of genuine talent. She turned away, reaching into her pocket for her car keys. Her frozen fingers fumbled, and the keys slipped, hitting the wet asphalt with a metallic clatter and skidding under the front tire of her sedan. Damn it, Jenkins grumbled. She dropped to her knees, the damp cold seeping instantly through her slacks. She pulled a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from her belt. It was a dual-beam model, equipped with a standard LED and a high-intensity ultraviolet bulb used for forensic blood spatter analysis at crime scenes. She clicked the flashlight on, accidentally hitting the secondary switch. A beam of deep, violet light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the ground as she searched for her keys. The beam inadvertently clipped the brick wall. Jenkins froze. Where the violet light touched the bricks, the mural changed. The obnoxious neon pinks and greens vanished, swallowed by the darkness. In their place, something else flared to life. It burned with a cold, radioactive green luminescence, searing itself into her vision. Slowly, her heart beginning to thump a steady, rising beat of adrenaline, Jenkins stood up. She raised the flashlight, sweeping the UV beam across the massive canvas of the koi fish. The chaotic scales were gone. Hidden beneath the mockery, glowing like a beacon in the night, was a meticulous, jagged string of text. 40.7128 degree N, 74.0060 degrees W Tuesday. 0200 hours. Heavy armor, asterisk. Jenkins stared at the glowing letters, her breath catching in her throat. She knew those coordinates. She knew the geography of the waterfront better than the back of her own hand. It was the old Canning district. The one place she hadn't managed to get a warrant to search because it was buried under 3 layers of corporate shell companies. She lowered the flashlight. The wall went dark, returning to the ugly, chaotic neon fish. She raised the light again. The coordinates blazed back at her. A slow, disbelieving smile spread across Detective Jenkins's face, cracking the exhaustion that had weighed her down for months. The city's biggest joke, the hack artist who painted neon nightmares, wasn't a joke at all. He was a mapmaker. A ghost watching the ghosts. "Well, I'll be damned, Vance," Jenkins whispered into the cold night air. "You really are a cipher." She snapped the flashlight off, retrieved her keys from the puddle, and slid into the driver's seat of her sedan. For the first time in 2 years, the hunt was actually on. She threw the car into drive, her tires spinning on the slick pavement as she sped toward the waterfront, leaving the neon canvas alone in the dark, waiting for the dawn. The rain in the city didn't fall, it seemed to manifest directly from the smog, a heavy, chemical mist that coated the high-rise windows in an oily sheen. Detective Sarah Jenkins stood in the center of the penthouse, listening to the relentless staccato of droplets against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Beyond the pane, the metropolis sprawled like a massive, glowing circuit board, its neon arteries bleeding magenta and sickly yellow into the suffocating night. Inside the penthouse, the air was entirely different. It smelled of ozone, spilled bourbon, and the undeniable, metallic tang of fresh blood. "Nothing on the security feeds, Detective," Officer Miller said, his voice hesitant as he stepped around a shattered glass coffee table. "Cameras in the lobby, the private elevator, even the street-level drones, they all looped perfectly for a 3-hour window. Whoever took him knew exactly what they were doing." Jenkins didn't look away from the panoramic window. She took a slow drag from her vapor cigarette, letting the synthetic mint burn the back of her throat before exhaling a thin stream of white smoke. "Of course they did. You don't just walk in and bag Marcus Thorne without knowing how to ghost the system." Marcus, the Viper, Thorne. The name alone commanded a terrified respect in the underworld. He was a shadow broker, a lone shark who wore bespoke Italian suits and dealt in secrets as much as he dealt in credits. Men like Thorne didn't just vanish. They went out in blazes of glory, or they didn't go out at all. Yet, here was his impenetrable fortress, breached and empty. Jenkins finally turned, her trench coat rustling, a heavy, damp sound in the cavernous room. Her sharp, dark eyes scanned the wreckage. The struggle had been brief but violently absolute. A priceless Ming vase had been reduced to ceramic shrapnel. The leather of a custom Barcelona chair was slashed, exposing white foam like a gaping wound. And then there was the blood. A single, smeared pool near the edge of a Persian rug, trailing off toward the balcony before simply ending. No body. No Thorne. She walked over to his massive, obsidian slab desk. Thorne was a meticulous man, a man who kept his life compartmentalized and encrypted. His terminal was slagged, the internal hard drive melted by a localized EMP spike. But Jenkins had learned long ago that when the digital world failed, the physical one always left a stain. "He was looking at something before they hit him," Jenkins murmured, her voice a low rasp that cut through the silence. She crouched behind the desk. "How do you know?" Miller asked, leaning over. Jenkins pointed a gloved finger at the floor mat beneath the desk. Amidst the debris of a shattered crystal decanter lay a single, physical photograph. It was an anomaly. People like Thorne didn't keep physical paper unless it meant something deeply personal, or deeply dangerous. She picked it up by the edges, careful not to smudge whatever might be left on the glossy surface. The image was a high-resolution print of a brick wall entirely covered in a chaotic, mesmerizing explosion of color. It was a mural. A street piece. Jenkins recognized it instantly. The whole precinct had been buzzing about it, mostly because the city's art elite had thrown a collective temper tantrum over it just 24 hours prior. It was the latest unauthorized installation by the Phantom Street artist known only as Leo Cypher Vance. The media had dubbed the piece the critic's joke after a prominent art historian called it a meaningless, aggressive smear of urban decay. Cypher had painted it overnight on the side of a derelict slaughterhouse in the Narrows, a neighborhood Thorne would never be caught dead in. "Why is the Viper looking at street art?" Miller asked, squinting at the photo. "He isn't," Jenkins said, her mind already racing, connecting the disparate threads of the night. Thorne didn't care about art. He cared about leverage. He cared about information. She slipped the photograph into an evidence bag, her jaw setting into a hard line. "Have the tech boys scrape every millimeter of this room. I want to know if Thorne bled out, or if he was just dragged away to bleed somewhere else." "Where are you going, detective?" "To appreciate some art." The drive down into the Narrows was a descent into the city's forgotten bowels. The sleek, hovering sedans of the upper tiers gave way to rusted ground cars and the heavy, mechanical groan of cargo trains. The neon down here wasn't corporate and clean, it was flickering, desperate, and broken. Jenkins parked her unmarked cruiser at the mouth of an alleyway that smelled of rotting cabbage and wet asphalt. She stepped out into the rain, pulling the collar of her coat up against the chill. The alley was dark, save for the rhythmic, strobing glare of a faulty streetlight at the far end. And there, illuminated in flashes of sickly sodium orange, was the mural. Even in the terrible lighting, the scale and ferocity of Leo Vance's work arrested her. It was a massive, sprawling beast of a painting. Jagged geometric shapes clashed with hyperrealistic portraits of weeping faces, all rendered in aggressive strokes of acid green, violent magenta, and toxic yellow. It was a visual riot, an assault on the senses that felt like a scream trapped in 2 dimensions. Jenkins approached the wall, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. She clicked on her heavy-duty tactical flashlight, cutting a brilliant beam of white light through the rain, and swept it across the brick canvas. The critics had called it a joke, a chaotic mess with no focal point. But Jenkins wasn't an art critic, she was a detective. She didn't look for beauty, she looked for patterns. She walked the length of the mural, letting the beam of her light wash over the vibrant aerosol strokes. Cypher was known for hiding messages in his work, political statements, anti-establishment rhetoric, poetry. But this felt different. It felt urgent. Her light stopped near the lower right quadrant. Amidst the chaotic explosion of warm, violent colors, there was a stark, jarring patch of deep, abyssal cobalt blue. It was a rectangular block, painted with thick, almost sculptural layers of impasto, standing out against the flat spray paint of the surrounding wall. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Jenkins stepped closer, until she was mere inches from the brick. The smell of fresh paint still lingered, sharp and intoxicating beneath the scent of the rain. She angled her flashlight so the beam hit the cobalt section obliquely, casting long shadows across the textured ridges of the paint. Her breath hitched. The texture wasn't random. The thick layers of cobalt blue had been applied with a palette knife, creating raised lines and grooves. From straight on, it just looked like a rough patch of paint. But illuminated from the side, the shadows formed distinct, undeniable characters. Numbers. Jenkins reached into her pocket, pulling out her datapad. She wiped the rain from the screen with her thumb and began to type out the characters hidden in the blue shadows. 40.7128 N 74.0060 W Alt 12. Coordinates, she whispered to the empty alley. Standard GPS coordinates, appended with an altitude marker. -12. 12 sublevels down. Jenkins stared at the glowing blue numbers on her datapad, the implications washing over her like ice water. Leo Cypher Vance hadn't just painted a mural. He had painted a map. And Marcus Thorne, a man who dealt in the city's darkest secrets, had found a photograph of this exact mural right before he was violently abducted from a secure penthouse. Did Thorne figure it out? Was he looking for whatever was buried 12 sublevels beneath these coordinates? Or was Thorne himself the secret? Did Cypher witness the abduction, or orchestrate it, leaving this breadcrumb trail for whoever was smart enough to look past the critic's joke? She looked back at the cobalt patch. The deep blue seemed to pulse in the beam of her flashlight, a silent siren song in the dark. Cypher was a ghost, a myth who painted the town and vanished into the smog. But he had made a mistake. He had involved himself in a murder, or a kidnapping. "You're not just a painter, Leo," Jenkins said softly, the rain plastering her dark hair to her forehead. "You're a witness." She holstered her flashlight and turned back toward her cruiser, her mind locking onto the coordinates. The location corresponded to the old, flooded subway tunnels beneath the financial district, a labyrinth of concrete and rusted steel that had been abandoned for decades. It was a place where things were meant to stay buried. Jenkins slid into the driver's seat of her car, the engine roaring to life with a guttural growl. She wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield, her eyes fixed on the distant, glittering towers of the city's elite. Marcus Thorne was out there, bleeding in the dark. And Leo Vance held the key. The critics had thought the painting was a punchline, but as Jenkins slammed the cruiser into gear and tore out of the alley, she knew the truth. The painting wasn't a joke. It was a blueprint. And the game had just begun. The East River shipyard did not sleep, it lay in a state of rusted, breathless waiting. Skeletal gantry cranes loomed against the bruise-purple canopy of the New York night, their massive steel limbs jutting upward like the legs of dead mantises. Below them, a labyrinth of corrugated shipping containers formed a geometric canyon, slick with the residue of a midnight drizzle. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of oxidized iron, diesel exhaust, and the brine of black water lapping at concrete pylons. Through this industrial graveyard moved Leo Vance. They called him Cypher in the underground, a moniker earned through aerosol and shadows. Tonight, he was entirely a creature of the dark, clad in a charcoal hoodie and black cargo pants, his face obscured by a dual-cartridge respirator that hung loosely around his neck. His backpack was heavy, clinking faintly with the muffled rattle of spray cans. Each can had its agitator P taped down or muffled with magnets to ensure absolute silence. In his line of work, noise was the enemy. Tonight, noise was a death sentence. Leo pressed his back against the damp, corrugated steel of a container, his breathing shallow and measured. 2 days ago, the cobalt coordinates he had deciphered from the late critic's final, morbid joke had pointed him here. Specifically, to the Iron Lazarus, a decommissioned freighter waiting to be broken down for scrap. Its towering hull was a sweeping expanse of oxidized red steel, the perfect canvas. It was the next piece of the map. He darted across the open tarmac, his rubber-soled boots making no sound on the wet concrete. Reaching the base of the freighter, he grabbed the cold, slick rungs of the maintenance ladder. The metal bit into his bare fingers, but the chill was a welcome anchor to reality. Hand over hand, he scaled the side of the behemoth, ascending 40 feet above the docks to a narrow maintenance catwalk that ran the length of the ship's port side. Below him, the shipyard was a patchwork of shadows and amber sodium lights. Above him, the sheer wall of the ship's hull waited. Leo pulled the respirator over his mouth and nose, the world instantly narrowing to the rhythmic hiss of his own breath. He unzipped his bag and withdrew his arsenal, midnight blue, electric cyan, bone white, and the crown jewel, a custom mixed aerosol laced with ultraviolet reactive polymer. He didn't need a sketch. The blueprint was burned into his cerebral cortex. He depressed the nozzle of the midnight blue. Hiss. The sharp, intoxicating bite of the solvent pierced the damp night air. Leo moved with a kinetic, almost violent grace. His arms swept in wide, fluid arcs, laying down the foundation. He wasn't just painting, he was carving a localized reality out of the void. The mural began to take shape, a colossal, biomechanical leviathan rising from an ocean of geometric waves. But the art, breathtaking as it would be to the naked eye, was merely a diversion. The true masterpiece lay in the negative space. He switched to the bone white, cutting sharp, jagged lines through the blue. These weren't just the highlights of the sea monster's scales, they were topological contours. The curvature of the beast's spine matched the exact elevation gradient of the city's underground subway maintenance tunnels. Then came the UV paint. Leo worked fast, his muscles burning from the awkward angles of the catwalk. He layered invisible strings of hexadecimal code into the spray of the ocean waves, painting the hidden coordinates that would link the cobalt mural from the warehouse district to the final location. He was lost in the flow state, the euphoric trance where the neon canvas was the only thing in the universe, when the grinding crunch of gravel shattered the silence. Leo froze. His finger hovered over the nozzle of the cyan can. Down on the docks, 3 vehicles rolled into the loading zone, 2 heavy-duty SUVs and a matte black Maybach that seemed to absorb the ambient light. They moved without headlights, predatory and silent, save for the tires chewing the wet earth. Leo crouched flat against the grated floor of the catwalk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He peered through the diamond-shaped gaps in the steel. The doors of the SUVs opened, and half a dozen men stepped out. They were broad-shouldered silhouettes carrying high-lumen tactical flashlights and the unmistakable, elongated shapes of suppressed submachine guns. Syndicate enforcers. The rear passenger door of the Maybach swung open. Marcus, the Viper, Thorne stepped onto the wet tarmac. Even from 40 feet up, Leo could feel the drop in temperature. Thorne was impeccably dressed in a tailored midnight blue overcoat, his silver hair catching the amber glow of the distant street lamps. He moved with a terrifying, unhurried elegance. He didn't look like a man who controlled the city's illegal arms and narcotics trade, he looked like a Wall Street titan assessing a bad investment. Spread out, Thorne's voice drifted up, smooth as glass and cold as the river. The Rad is painting us a picture. Find him before the paint dries. The beams of their flashlights ignited, slicing through the mist like lightsabers. They began sweeping the labyrinth of shipping containers, moving methodically toward the Iron Lazarus. Leo swore silently behind his mask. The mural was finished, but the invisible UV layer needed another 60 seconds to set before the ambient moisture of the fog ruined the chemical bond. He couldn't just run, if he abandoned it now, the coordinate string would bleed into an illegible smear. He stayed plastered to the grate, watching a beam of light sweep up the hull of the ship, stopping just 10 feet short of his freshly painted Leviathan. Check the gantries, one of the enforcers barked. Heavy boots hit the metal stairs at the far end of the ship. They were coming up. Leo capped his cans, shoving them violently into his backpack. He slung the bag over his shoulder and crept in the opposite direction, moving blindly along the catwalk. The rust crunched softly under his boots. Every step was a calculated risk. At the end of the catwalk lay a sheer drop into the black water of the East River, or a desperate leap to the adjacent cargo crane. Hey! Fresh paint smell, a voice echoed from the stairs behind him. Up here on the port side. Damn it! Leo broke into a sprint. The stealth was over. Behind him, the unmistakable pink thwack of a suppressed round ricocheted off the steel bulkhead, missing his head by inches. He didn't look back. He reached the end of the catwalk, mounted the guardrail, and launched himself into the empty air. For a breathless second, he was flying through the freezing fog. Then, he slammed hard into the steel lattice of the cargo crane, his ribs screaming in protest. He gripped the cold metal, his boots scrambling for purchase, and hauled himself into the shadows of the crane's operator cabin. Down below, chaos erupted. But it wasn't the enforcers shooting at Leo. A pair of blinding spotlights flared to life from the far side of the dock, pinning Thorne's men against the side of the freighter. A siren wailed, a short, aggressive burst that cut through the night. NYPD. Drop the weapons and put your hands on the vehicles. Leo peered over the edge of the crane. A lone, unmarked police cruiser had blocked the shipyard's exit. Standing behind the open door, weapon drawn and leveled across the roof of the car, was Detective Sarah Jenkins. Her trench coat whipped around her knees in the maritime wind. Even in the gloom, Leo could see the fierce, uncompromising set of her jaw. Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't even turn to face her. He simply raised a gloved hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons. "Detective Jenkins," Thorne called out, his voice a mocking purr. "To what do we owe the pleasure of the city's finest at this ungodly hour?" "I could ask you the same thing, Marcus," Jenkins shouted back, her grip on her service weapon unwavering. "Last I checked, trespassing on a condemned municipal shipyard wasn't in your portfolio. Call off your dogs. We're merely taking a stroll, detective. Admiring the industrial decay. Do it from the sidewalk," she snapped. "Or I start running serial numbers on those pieces your boys are trying to hide behind their backs." It was a standoff. Jenkins was vastly outgunned, and Thorne knew it. But Thorne also knew that gunning down a decorated detective in an open shipyard would bring a heat he couldn't afford to deal with while the map was still in play. Leo watched from the shadows of the crane, his breath catching. Jenkins hadn't just stumbled upon them. She was tracking Thorne. Or, he realized with a jolt of paranoia, she was tracking him. As Thorne's men slowly backed toward their SUVs, their weapons lowered, Jenkins' gaze flicked upward. For a fraction of a second, her eyes locked onto the massive, freshly painted Leviathan on the side of the Iron Lazarus. The wet paint gleamed under the ambient light. Then, her eyes tracked higher, sweeping over the lattice of the cargo crane. She couldn't possibly see him in the impenetrable dark of the operator's cabin, but Leo felt the weight of her stare. She knew he was there. She was giving him a window. "Time to go, Marcus," Jenkins demanded, racking the slide of her weapon for emphasis. Thorne offered a mock bow. "Always a pleasure, detective." He slipped back into the cavernous interior of the Maybach. The SUVs fired up, their engines a low, angry rumble, and the convoy peeled out of the shipyard, their taillights bleeding red into the fog. Jenkins stood alone in the rain for a long moment. She holstered her weapon, took out a small flashlight, and walked over to the base of the freighter. She shined the beam up at the mural. The biomechanical beast stared back at her. She didn't pull out a radio. She didn't call for backup. She simply reached into her coat, pulled out a digital camera, and took 3 high-resolution photographs of the artwork. "You're playing a dangerous game, Cypher," Jenkins murmured to the empty air, her voice carrying on the wind. She turned and walked back to her cruiser, the tires splashing through the deep puddles as she drove away into the neon-lit arteries of the city. High above, Leo finally let out a shuddering breath. He pulled a small, heavy UV flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on, shining it across the gap toward the freighter. The invisible paint flared to life, glowing with an ethereal, radioactive green. The hexadecimal coordinates burned brightly within the waves of the mural, a secret language hiding in plain sight. The midnight gallery was open. The next piece of the blueprint was secure. Leo pulled his hood up against the rain and began the long climb down into the shadows, moving toward the coordinates that would take him deeper into the violent heart of the city. Marcus Thorne discovers that a secret topographical map of his smuggling routes has been hidden within several high-profile street murals. Fearing exposure, he orders his chief enforcer to destroy the artwork and capture the artist responsible before the authorities can decode the information. Detective Sarah Jenkins independently uncovers the hidden data within the murals and realizes the artist is actually a whistleblower. She is forced to hide in the shadows as Thorn's crew arrives with industrial equipment to chemically erase the artwork, realizing that the artist's life is now in immediate danger. Although his previous work is being systematically destroyed, Leo Vance resolves to strike one final blow against Thorn's empire. He gathers his supplies to create a definitive piece of art that will expose the truth to the entire city. Would you like a summary of the next chapter? The wind lashed across the 70-story summit of the Vanguard Tower, a serrated blade of freezing air that smelled of ozone, river sludge, and the exhaust of 8 million breathing souls. Leo Cypher Vance stood on the precipice, his toes curling over the architectural lip of the skyscraper. Beneath him, the city was a sprawling, luminous circuit board of gold and sodium orange. Vertigo, a familiar and demanding lover, tugged at his center of gravity. He didn't step back. His ribs screamed in protest, a lingering symphony of pain from the alleyway ambush 2 nights ago. The bruises painted across his torso were a violent violet, rivaling the shades he currently carried in the customized tactical rig strapped to his chest. Thorn's men had tried to erase him. They had tried to erase the trail of breadcrumbs he had sprayed across the city's underbelly. But erasure was only a temporary state. It only primed the canvas for something louder. Leo checked the carabiners connecting his climbing harness to the reinforced steel anchor points he drilled into the roof's maintenance housing. Click. Secure. He tugged the static line, letting his weight settle into the nylon webbing. Adrenaline, cold and metallic, flooded his veins, temporarily washing away the exhaustion. He pulled his respirator over his mouth and nose, the twin filters hissing with his every breath. He was no longer just a man, he was an extension of the aerosol, a conduit for the city's suppressed truth. Taking a deep breath, Leo stepped off the edge. The drop was a momentary, stomach-vaulting plunge before the descender caught, snapping him against the sheer glass face of the tower. He dangled hundreds of feet above the concrete abyss, suspended by a millimeter of woven synthetic fiber. To his right, the massive, unlit billboard spanning the top 10 floors of the tower awaited him, a virgin expanse of matte black steel and frosted glass. He drew the first can. The agitator ball rattled inside, a rhythmic, staccato beat that synchronized with his heart. He depressed the customized fat cap nozzle. Hiss, a thick, blinding arc of ultraviolet reactive neon green slapped against the dark surface. The masterpiece had begun. Leo moved like a spider dancing on a web of his own making, kicking off the glass, swinging in wide, pendulum arcs. He painted with his entire body, the cans becoming extensions of his forearms. He layered the base coats first, broad strokes of toxic yellow and deep, bruising cobalt. He didn't need a stencil, the blueprint was seared into the back of his retinas. Down on the streets below, the city was beginning to notice. Detective Sarah Jenkins slammed the door of her unmarked cruiser, the wail of distant sirens bleeding into the incessant honking of midnight traffic on Fifth Avenue. She tipped her head back, the collar of her trench coat snapping in the wind, and stared up at the Vanguard Tower. Even from this distance, the sheer scale of what Cypher was doing was breathtaking. The slashes of neon color were visible against the black sky, a glowing wound opening up on the face of the corporate monolith. Jenkins, what the hell are we looking at? Her partner, Miller, materialized beside her, holding a pair of heavy tactical binoculars. Give me those, Jenkins demanded, snatching the lenses and pressing them to her eyes. The blurry streaks of color snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. She saw the sweeping, muscular coils of a massive serpent, a viper, rendered in impossible, hyperrealistic detail. Its scales shimmered in optical illusions of cobalt and blood orange. But it wasn't just a snake. The beast was wrapped around a colossal, geometric grid that looked like a shattered compass rose. And within the grid, massive, blocky typography was beginning to take shape. Numbers. He's not just defacing a landmark, Jenkins murmured, her breath pluming in the chill air. He's drawing a map. 40 degrees, 73 degrees, latitude and longitude, Jenkins realized, her blood running cold. She dropped the binoculars. He's burning Marcus Thorne. He's putting the exact coordinates of Thorne's reinforced penthouse on the tallest building in the skyline. He's exposing the Viper's nest to the feds, the cartels, the rival gangs, everyone. That's a death sentence, Miller said. For Thorne, maybe. But Thorne won't let him finish. Jenkins drew her sidearm, her eyes darting to the service entrance of the Vanguard Tower. Thorne's cleaners are already inside. I know it. Call for backup. ESU, aviation, whatever you can get. We need to get to the roof. She didn't wait for Miller's response, sprinting toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby. 300 feet up, Leo's arms burned with lactic acid. He had completed the Viper's head, its fangs dripping with a toxic, glowing venom that seamlessly morphed into the directional arrows of the compass. Now came the numbers. The undeniable, immutable data. 40.7589 degrees north. He swapped cans, his cold, paint-stained fingers clumsily finding the nozzle of an electric blue aerosol. He kicked off the glass, swinging right to begin the longitude line. Suddenly, the static rope above him jerked violently. Leo slammed chest first into the glass, the breath exploding from his lungs. His ribs flared with agonizing, white-hot pain. He looked up. Silhouetted against the ambient glow of the city, 3 figures stood on the roof's edge. Even through the darkness, Leo could see the gleam of a serrated blade in one of the men's hands. Thorne's fixers. They had found him. The man with the knife knelt, pressing the blade against Leo's primary climbing line. Leo didn't panic, panic was for amateurs. He had anticipated this. He immediately unclipped his secondary ascender, transferring his weight to the backup line anchored to a different, hidden point 10 yards across the roof. But to make the swing, he would have to drop. Hiss, he sprayed a blinding burst of silver paint directly upward, a futile but instinctual distraction, just as the primary rope snapped. Gravity claimed him. Leo fell, a stomach-churning plummet of 15 feet before the secondary line caught with a bone-jarring crack. His harness dug into his thighs, bruising muscle and straining joints. He swung wildly in a massive arc across the face of the building, slamming into the glass facade hard enough to spiderweb the reinforced pane. Above him, the fixers moved to cut the second line. NYPD. Drop the weapon. The muffled shout of Sarah Jenkins echoed from the roof, followed instantly by the sharp, concussive crack of a 9mm warning shot. Leo didn't look up to watch the firefight. He didn't have time. He was hanging by a literal thread, swinging like a pendulum, and the piece wasn't finished. The longitude was incomplete. He needed the final numbers. Hanging upside down, his legs wrapped desperately around the remaining nylon rope to stabilize himself, Leo shook his last can of Hazard Yellow. The agitator ball rattled. The gunshot above him was answered by a burst of automatic fire. Glass rained down from the parapet, glittering like diamonds in the neon glow of the streetlights below. 73.9851 degrees west. Leo depressed the cap. He used the momentum of his swing, letting the physics of the pendulum guide his arm. He sprayed the 7. He kicked off the glass, twisting his torso through the agonizing pain, and sprayed the 3. The paint flew, thick and brilliant. He could smell the potent, chemical bite of the acrylic, the sweet scent of rebellion. The wind tried to tear the mist away, but Leo was too close, his technique too flawless. He hit the decimal. The 9. The 8. Another body fell from the roof, one of Thorne's men, plunging past Leo into the dark abyss, screaming until the sound was swallowed by the city. Leo ignored it. He swung back. The 5. The 1. The degree symbol. The W. He released the nozzle. The can sputtered, completely empty, and he tossed it into the void. It was done. Above him, the gunfire ceased. Vance. Jenkins' voice drifted down, breathless and ragged over the edge of the parapet. "Vance, you crazy son of a bitch, are you alive?" Leo hung suspended, panting, sweat stinging his eyes beneath the respirator. He grabbed the ascender and slowly, agonizingly, began to crank himself up the remaining rope toward the roof. As he crested the parapet, collapsing onto the cold, tar-papered surface of the roof beside a panting Jenkins and two handcuffed mercenaries, the city responded to his work. Across the street, the massive automated floodlights of the neighboring corporate plaza flared to life, their nightly scheduled illumination clicking on at exactly midnight. The brilliant, high-wattage beams struck the face of the Vanguard Tower. The masterpiece ignited. The ultraviolet and neon paints, formulated with photoluminescent compounds Leo had chemically engineered in his sink, absorbed the light and roared into impossible brilliance. The giant, coiled viper seemed to writhe against the glass, an optical leviathan of cobalt and blood. And blazing within its coils, brighter than the billboards of Times Square, were the exact coordinates. 3 miles away, in the velvet-lined, impenetrable silence of a penthouse overlooking the East River, Marcus, the Viper, Thorne stood with a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. He was staring out his floor-to-ceiling windows, admiring his empire. Then, his gaze locked onto the Vanguard Tower in the distance. The glass in Thorne's hand shattered, amber liquid and blood dripping onto the imported Persian rug. The glowing numbers burned across the skyline, a colossal, undeniable beacon pointing directly at him. His secret sanctuary, his hidden fortress, was now broadcast to the entire criminal underworld and every law enforcement agency in the state. Back on the roof, Leo Vance pulled off his respirator and spat over the edge. He looked at Jenkins, an exhausted, bloodied smile cracking through the paint splatters on his face. "Tell the precinct," Leo whispered, his voice hoarse. "The exhibition is officially open." The dawn did not break over the metropolis, it bled. It seeped through the jagged skyline in bruised hues of violet and harsh, metallic gold, washing over a city that had forgotten how to sleep. At the heart of the financial district, projected across the colossal, windowless eastern wall of the old Munson building, was the masterpiece. It was 70 stories of unadulterated defiance, a digital and aerosol leviathan that had gone viral before the paint had even dried. From the command center inside the armored Bearcat, Detective Sarah Jenkins stared at the live feed of the mural on her tactical monitor. Her coffee had long since gone cold, tasting of ash and adrenaline. The image was hypnotic, a sprawling, chaotic portrait of a serpent constricting a human heart, painted in electrifying strokes of ultraviolet and cobalt blue. But it wasn't the artistry that had mobilized 3 separate tactical units of the FBI before sunrise. It was the data. Leo Cypher Vance hadn't just painted a picture, he had painted a confession. "Zoom in on the serpent's scales," Jenkins ordered the tech beside her, her voice a low, raspy bark. The screen magnified the cobalt blue interlocking patterns. They weren't just scales. Woven into the fractal geometry were strings of alphanumeric text, Cayman Island routing numbers, offshore shell company registries, and the exact longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of Marcus, the Viper, Thorne's illicit storehouses. The jagged crimson lines radiating from the serpent's fangs. Shipping routes for the human trafficking and weapon smuggling rings Thorne had spent a decade building in the shadows. "The internet is tearing it apart," the tech murmured, all bleeding through his professional detachment. Reddit, Twitter, the dark web. Cypher open-sourced the decryption key at midnight. Every ledger, every bribe, every dirty politician Thorne has in his pocket, it's all public. The server traffic is so heavy it crashed the stock exchange's early trading feeds. Jenkins allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "You actually did it, Leo," she thought. "You brilliant, crazy bastard. All right, listen up." Jenkins shouted, grabbing the comms mic, her eyes hardening as she looked around at the heavily armored FBI hostage rescue team operators crammed into the vehicle. "Thorne knows he's exposed. The rat is going to try and flee the ship. We hit all 4 locations simultaneously. Team Alpha, you're with me at the Chelsea Gallery. We breach in 60 seconds. No knocks. No warnings. We take the Viper's head. The Bearcat rumbled to a halt. Outside, the rain from the night before had left the asphalt slick, reflecting the flashing red and blue strobes of the police cruisers cordoning off the block. Marcus Thorne's Sanctuary was a high-end, minimalist art gallery in Chelsea, a pristine fortress of frosted glass, white marble, and silence. It was the perfect front for a man who laundered millions through the very art world that had once mocked Leo Vance. Jenkins racked the slide of her Glock 19. Go. The breach was a symphony of orchestrated violence. A battering ram shattered the 10-foot-high frosted glass doors, the sound like a bomb detonating in a cathedral. Glass rained down like diamonds across the polished marble floors as dark-clad operators poured into the lobby, their assault rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the gloom like angry red hornets. FBI. Show your hands. Get down. The shouts echoed off the barren walls. Thorne's private security, men used to intimidating gallery owners and breaking the fingers of indebted artists, froze. Faced with the overwhelming, synchronized brutality of the federal raid, they dropped their weapons, their expensive suits offering no armor against the reality of a federal indictment. Jenkins didn't stop in the lobby. She moved with practiced lethality, flanked by 2 HRT operators, heading straight for the rear of the gallery. Cypher's mural had detailed a hidden freight elevator behind a false wall, leading to Thorne's subterranean vault. She found the keypad exactly where the cobalt paint had promised it would be. A breaching charge made quick work of the reinforced steel doors. Down below, in the harsh fluorescent glare of the bunker, Marcus Thorne was panicking. The Viper was a man who usually smelled of bespoke sandalwood cologne and absolute control. Now, he reeked of sweat and desperation. He was frantically throwing hard drives into a commercial shredder, his tailored Brioni suit jacket discarded on the floor. Stacks of bearer bonds and foreign currency sat in open briefcases on a mahogany desk. Step away from the shredder, Marcus, Jenkins commanded, her weapon leveled squarely at his chest. Thorne spun around, his aristocratic face pale, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He looked at the laser dot dancing over his heart, then at Jenkins. "This is an illegal search," he spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You have no warrant for this level. My lawyers will have your badge, Jenkins. I'll own you by tomorrow morning." "We have a warrant," Jenkins said, stepping fully into the room, her boots crunching over a stray USB drive. "Issued by a federal judge 30 minutes ago. Based on highly public, irrefutable probable cause." She pulled a folded, glossy printout from her tactical vest and tossed it onto the desk. It was a high-resolution photograph of Cypher's masterpiece. Thorne stared at the image, his jaw ticking. "Vance," he whispered, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "That street rat nobody. I erased him. I burned his studio to the ground. I took his life." "You tried," Jenkins corrected, holstering her weapon as the operators moved in to secure Thorne's wrists in heavy zip ties. "But he painted a bigger picture. You're done, Marcus. The trafficking, the extortion, the murders. It's all out there. The neon canvas just lit up your whole dark world." Thorne was shoved against the wall, his rights read to him in a dull, clinical monotone. As they frog-marched the broken crime lord out of the vault and up toward the flashing lights of the street, Jenkins lingered for a moment. She looked at the shredded hard drives and the millions in cash. A quiet vindication settled in her chest. The law had finally caught up, but it had needed art to shine the light. 50 stories above the Chelsea Gallery, perched on the cold, gargoyle-adorned ledge of a neighboring neo-Gothic skyscraper, Leo Vance sat with his legs dangling over the abyss. The wind howled at this altitude, biting and frigid, but Leo didn't feel the cold. He was exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. His black hoodie was torn, his hands were blistered, and his fingernails were permanently stained with the cobalt blue and ultraviolet pigments that had consumed his life for the past month. He smelled of aerosol propellant, ozone, and survival. He watched the tactical vehicles swarming the street below like metallic beetles. He watched the tiny, suited figure of Marcus Thorne being forced into the back of a black SUV. Leo pulled his respirator down from his face, letting it hang around his neck. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the morning air. It tasted like exhaust fumes and freedom. The critics' joke. That was what they had called him. The establishment had laughed at his work, called it derivative, juvenile, a temporary stain on the city's pristine architecture. Thorne had tried to commodify him, and when Leo refused, Thorne had tried to erase him. They had all underestimated the power of the paint. They didn't understand that the city wasn't just a backdrop, it was a living, breathing organism, and Leo knew how to make it speak. Down on the street, Detective Jenkins stepped out of the gallery. Before she got into her cruiser, she paused. The chaos of the raid swirled around her, sirens wailing, radios squawking, reporters already breaking through the police barricades with their cameras flashing. But Jenkins ignored them. She turned her gaze upward. She couldn't possibly see him. The distance was too great, the shadows clinging to the high ledges too deep. Yet, she looked precisely at the rooftop where Leo was perched. Slowly, deliberately, Jenkins raised 2 fingers to her brow in a crisp, silent salute. A tight, genuine smile broke through the grime and exhaustion on Leo's face. He didn't wave back. He didn't need to. The conversation between them had already been written in 100-foot letters across the skyline. Leo pushed himself up from the ledge. The sun finally crested the horizon, casting long, blinding rays of light through the concrete canyons of New York. The neon signs below, the buzzing dive bars, the bodega windows, the billboards, began to flicker and die, surrendering to the dawn. But Leo's masterpiece would remain. It was burned into the digital consciousness of the world, a permanent scar on the syndicate that had tried to swallow him whole. He picked up his duffel bag, the spray cans inside clinking together with a rhythmic, metallic chime. He turned his back on the sunrise and walked toward the fire escape. He was Leo Cypher Vance. He was the ghost in the machine, the phantom of the alleyways. As the sirens faded into the morning rush hour, Leo slipped over the edge and descended into the labyrinth of the city, fading back into the shadows. He left the concrete world behind, knowing that whenever it grew too dark, he could always paint the light.